Ladies and gentlemen, or rather, dear friends, I appreciate very much your getting up on a Saturday morning to a talk, and I am very, very moved still at yesterday's performance, and I regard this as one of the highlights of my entire life. It would be boring and useless to list all my teachers, because I've been one of those people who switched a great deal. And if I omit a few names, it is not that I'm not grateful for what they gave me, but they would be a bunch of meaningless persons. And so let me not dwell too long on my first teachers. I started the piano in Trieste with a graduate of the Bologna Conservatory, and it has been my experience in life that somehow everything comes back. So that's the young people among you, that be a lesson. Never, never, never fight with anybody, because it comes back. Not that I did fight with her, in fact she was a very nice teacher. She was of the old school. Finger exercises first, and then as a bonbon, as a reward, you could play a piece. We have changed our minds a little bit about that, perhaps too much, but I'm not going to go into this. Trieste does not have a distinguished musical past. In fact, a great opportunity for Trieste to be on the musical map of the world was missed by the circumstance that Busoni's parents were on a concert tour. And so Busoni, who really by rights should be a Triestine, was born in Empoli, near Florence. And that's Empoli's only claim to fame that I know of. But Busoni, by all rights, should be really named as the great musical figure of Trieste. More important for my own development is the fact that Trieste, being part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy when I was born, was a trilingual town. It was Italian, German, and Slavic. And one practically had to grow up bilingual in order to get along there. One did not learn Slavic because together with the trilingual stratification, there went a social stratification, and unskilled labor was usually the Slavic element. But there was a certain interest in the Slavs who were living there and nearby. So it is no accident that most Triestines speak several languages, and I had occasion to learn several languages very early in my life. And generally speaking, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, being multilingual, is the cradle of the science, you can call it that, of linguistics. All the great linguists of the early 20th century or even 19th century come from Prague or from Vienna. My undoing in getting into music is the fact that I have what is called absolute pitch or perfect pitch or pitch recognition. At that time, one thought this is a sure sign of musicianship. I think it is completely wrong. It has nothing to do with musicianship. It's a memory phenomenon. Some of fairly well-known composers like Mozart and Wagner did not have perfect pitch, for all we know. But anyway, my mother, who was very musical herself, thought this is it. And so I became a musician. And then we moved to Vienna, and I had lessons with a student of Leschetizky. And ungrateful as I am, I cannot tell you much about her, except that I remember I was trained in very high raised fingers, and then a vaulting movement on the fifth finger when you turn back on the scale. And that is about all I remember. Whether this was genuine Lesetitsky or whether that was her version of it, I do not know. Anyway, she was a good teacher, but just the motto is nisi bene, but of course the teaching, the quality of teaching, the intensity of teaching, the psychology of teaching has improved enormously since my early days. I don't think I'm doing an injustice to her in saying that the criticism she gave, and most teachers gave at the time, was all right, but not quite good enough, take it again, and not much more. And so I waded through stacks of Shelley, through stacks of Kramer. Hanon wasn't on the map yet at the time, otherwise I would have waded through Hanon. And some people who are no longer very much on the map were also waded through. In retrospect, I am grateful for it because those fingers, I have still no technical problems in the sense that I play as badly as I played 40 years ago. But I do not have to worry about warming up and all that sort of thing. So enough of that. After we had moved to Vienna, I had piano lessons with a Sauer pupil, simply because I originally wanted to study and had auditioned for the teacher of Rudolf Serkin, Richard Robert. I auditioned in the spring, but he passed away in the summer, and that was that. And then I studied with a very fine, very gentle man, in the true sense of the word, and I stress that because I behaved like a louse. He prepared me for entering the conservatory, and then, under the influence of the man that I'm going to mention in a minute, I switched and did not enter his class. So I have full understanding for students who similar things in institutions that shall remain unnamed. Anyway, together with the Latin school that I attended, I also studied counterpoint. And the man with whom I studied counterpoint was one of the most kindly people that I have ever met. His studio attached to his home, as it was customary in these days, was smoke-filled. He smoked a pipe, and for some reason that seemed odd to me or something. I felt a little uncomfortable, and I was too young. He taught me counterpoint, and the great fashion at the time was to teach counterpoint before harmony. Now anybody who is a musician would know that the two go together, and for some reason the great fashion was to do counterpoint before. I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't hear what I wrote down on paper. I counted up intervals when I wrote parallel fifths. I didn't write parallel fifths. Sometimes I miscounted. My mathematics has never been very strong, and so I did write parallel fifths. With one word, this very kind man was a terror for me at the time. And I found out much later how nice and kind he was. It went so far that I had to go through a ritual before taking a lesson. I had to walk around the block before I went up there. So I have, again, full understanding for students who are afraid of teachers. Teachers are not such ogres in general, but somehow they create an image of toughness, and I am deeply ashamed of myself. The man I talked about, and I said everything comes back, is Karl Weide, and the dean and I are now the consultants for the Karl Weide Memorial Foundation at Indiana University. Please don't tell his widow, Mrs. Karl Weide in New York, what I just said. But he was a coach under Gustav Mahler, a composer of note, and I think it might be a good dissertation topic for somebody to write about those composers in Vienna who were not members of the so-called Second Vienna School. And there were some quite distinguished names among them. The earliest one, perhaps Karl Goldmark, who died 1915. His opera, The Queen of Sheba, is still being performed. His pastoral overture I heard recently on the radio. Then there was Wilhelm Kienzl, who wrote an opera, The Evangeliemann, Wagner descendant, so to say, spiritually. Then there was Hugo Kauder, who lived in this country. There was Ernst Korngold, who before Hollywood ruined him was a very distinguished composer, so to say, the Menotti of Vienna, a very early talent. Then there was Joseph Marx, whose songs are still being performed, and several others that I could mention. And I think it might not be a bad idea to lump them together and write a dissertation on the musical atmosphere of Vienna outside of the Second Vienna School. As I said, I entered the gymnasium first. The gymnasium is a kind of Latin school that is the preparation for entering the university. At that time, the only avenue to university study. It has loosened up a little bit, but not very much. And there I had a professor of Latin and Greek who was one of the great influences on my life, of whom I would like to speak a little bit at length. I attended a gymnasium close to my home. Then he became director of another gymnasium, and I had to walk 40 minutes to school and 40 minutes back, but I followed him there in the hope that he would continue to take my form, but he didn't, but I still had close relations with him, or fairly close relations with him. In some ways, his career parallels or anti-parallels mine. We were fairly well-to-do before World War I. My parents were very much pro-Habsburg, which was rare in Trieste, and invested everything in war bonds, and after the World War, we were wiped out. He was born as a very poor widow's father passed away before he saw the light of the world, and was very poor in his youth. He somehow managed to study and to get the certificate, the Lehramtsbefähigung, short of the PhD, because he didn't have the money to finish his PhD. And he became professor in a secondary school, in a gymnasium, then director of a secondary school. Later on, he became Hofrat, which is a distinction in Austria, even in the Republic. You can still be named Hofrat, which means court counselor, and he became an honorary PhD in his own field by the University of Vienna. This man wrote extensively, and we have at least two of his books in the IU library. One is the study of those languages that were spoken in Asia Minor before the Greeks, before Alexander the Great, Hellenized Asia Minor. One of these nations that lived there were the Lydians. Now possibly some of you have seen Love for Lydia on television, yes? The name Lydia. The musicians among you know about the Lydian scale. Some of you may know of King Croesus, the richest man of antiquity. And if you want to know what Solon, the wise lawgiver of Athens, said to Croesus, you can read it in Greek, but what he answered was in Lydian. And if you want to know what he answered, it's in this book. I recommend highly that you read this book. Another book, and it's, I believe, still a classic, is the Handbook of Italic Dialects by this man, Emil Vetter, Vetter, about whom I speak. We have it here in the library, and somebody must have looked at it, because it is used. This deals with those languages spoken in Italy before the Romans Latinized Italy. You must never forget that Rome originally was a little farming community, a little bit like a, I don't know, like a kibbutz, I think. And they were soldier farmers, and they were a little bit short of the fair sex, it seems, because at one time they abducted the Sabine women. And if you want to know what this abduction, or let's call it by its proper name, it's the rape of the Sabine women looked like, all you have to do is look at this picture by Rubens, the rape of the Sabine women. And if you want to know what these Sabine women said when they were carried off by the Roman horsemen, you have to look in this book. And in order to quiet your concern, there is also the picture of what the Sabine women said after they had been reconciled to their fate. And again, it's all written in there by Emil Vetter. So this was the great influence that made me a split personality. And he wanted me to become a philologist. And I have never quite lived it down. And now entering second childhood, I have in a way gone back to that, and perhaps it's in order to fulfill his memory, or whatever you want to call it, that I'm now again studying Greek. Maybe I didn't stress enough that his main field was Latin and Greek, not only these other languages. He was very thoroughly trained in epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions. And the study of inscriptions, of course, is one of the main sources of our knowledge of antiquity. He also collaborated on the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, the great thesaurus of the Latin language, and he published very extensively on Greek etymology and the like. The atmosphere in these secondary schools in Central Europe in my days was entirely different from the atmosphere in schools in this country. There was no there were no 1960s, so to say. There was no revolutionary spirit at all. But there was somehow the feeling that all these profs are presumptuous, funny, and one ridiculed them by nicknames, and particularly one played practical jokes on them. For instance, a tuning fork was being struck and passed around quickly from one to the other under the bench, you see, so that the professor could never find out where this noise came from. Of course, I had nothing to do with that. And thin wires were attached to maps on the wall, and they were pulled so that the whole set of maps fell down, and it looked as if an earthquake had occurred, and that sort of thing. And on the other hand, we had a kind of united front against the teacher. Some of them, I would say the majority of them, deserved it. Vetter, in my memory, is perhaps the only exception. He was respected, he was a little bit feared, but he wasn't touched. His teaching could be criticized. He jumped sometimes from one subject to the other. Lessons were partly conducted in Latin, both ways, on his part and on the part of the student. Anyway, for me, it took, and I've never gotten over it. He has a very distinguished obituary in the leading journal of antiquity, and he is a name that I think will not be forgotten. He was not above taking things out on individuals. It was a time of sarcasm and general disappointment in how things had turned out after the World War. He was not above that, but that is all forgotten and forgiven, and all I remember about him is the greatness of the man. I am very lucky in then being able to study here at the Department of Classical Studies, because the orientation of Vetter is diametrically opposed to the orientation of this department, at least as much as I can see. He was word-oriented, and he perhaps stressed grammar and syntax more than was absolutely necessary. This department, and Professor Lom has given me the honor to be here, and Professor Piller, deals with antiquity as a cultural phenomenon and really tries to make us understand what antiquity meant, what it was all about, and what it can still mean for our time. So I'm very lucky to now see the other, one of the many other facets with which one can deal with this huge field of which I'm just nibbling away, and it's too late for me to get anywhere. I'm perfectly conscious of that, but I'm having more fun than if I did crossword puzzles. So I want to give tribute to my Greek teacher there. I also had the good fortune when I restarted studying here under Professor Tiller, and then soon thereafter, to have the teaching of a visiting professor from Oxford, Professor Fraser, Peter Fraser. I was again tremendously impressed with the scholarship of these gentlemen, and particularly Professor Fraser opened a field for me which I will never be able to go into, the field of late antiquity. And his main work is on Ptolemaic Alexandria. What did Alexandria look like after Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt and Hellenized Egypt? So for instance, if you want to know what Cleopatra and Mark Antony talked about when they didn't make love, this is where it's written. So much about this group of teachers, and let me now come to the man who got me away from the Sauer pupil with whom I studied and made me a Schmidt pupil. Walter Bricht was my lifelong friend, mentor, and teacher. He was Schmidt's favorite pupil. I coached with him before I entered the conservatory. I coached with him even while I was a Schmidt pupil. Most Schmidt pupils coached with somebody else. I'll explain why that was necessary, desirable at least. And as life goes on, I was in Texas, he was in New York, I was in Bloomington, he was in New York, I was in Naples for 1 year, and lo and behold, when I came back from Naples, Walter Brist was here as professor of piano. To my great joy, I had been after Dean Bain to engage him, but as Dean Bain himself said, if I had had a little more brains, I would have engaged him earlier. Anyway, here he was, and again our friendship was close, and I had the privilege of performing 2 of his sonatas, a solo piano sonata, and then with Professor Mark his cello sonata. And Walter Brist established himself as musical personality in no time in this place. And I think he's the only one who started out as professor of piano and then, at his own wish, switched to become professor of voice. And he was equally qualified to do that because he had the thorough Schmidt training that we all had, and through virtue of the fact that his mother had been a very well-known, famous lieder singer, friend of Hugo Wolf and of Brahms, he had grown up with singers and knew more about voice than many, many other voice teachers, I'm sure. And so he became professor of voice, and unfortunately passed away with a very, very miserable ailment, much too soon, much too soon. His music, I believe, will live. There are 7 sonatas of his. I have 1 or 2 duplicates. If somebody should be interested in a minor sonata, a small work, sonata in A minor, I can let him have a duplicate. And one of his students wrote a dissertation on these sonatas, so I do hope that all this will serve to keep his memory alive. And just yesterday, I very kindly received a manuscript of his. One of his sonatas I copied by hand at one time before performing it, because Xerox was not very popular at the time. And so Walter Brist was the one who brought me to Schmidt, and I'll be eternally grateful to him for that, as for many, many other things. Now, Franz Schmidt was born in, it's hard to say, he was born in Poszony at the time. Pressburg at the time when you talked German. Bratislava when you talk Czech. It is now part of Czechoslovakia. With one word, it is a town down the Danube between Vienna and Budapest. It has a bit of a musical history. It was the birthplace of Johann Nepomuk Hummel, student of Mozart, question mark friend of Beethoven, predecessor of Liszt in Weimar, and a composer of distinction. It was also the town where the kings of Hungary were crowned, and it was also the town where Liszt received his Hungarian honorary citizenship. It was also the town where Ernst von Dohnányi was born. In fact, Dohnányi's father was a physics professor at the gymnasium where Schmidt was a pupil, and at one time they both played in the student production. And Dohnányi is, for various reasons, a name that is known all over the world. Schmidt is not. I will give you a bit of a picture of Schmidt's pedagogic effectiveness by reading off a few names that were, in one way or another, his students. They were not all his piano students. They were partly his counterpoint and composition students. But you will recognize a few names. Herbert von Karajan is not entirely unknown. He was his composition counterpoint student for several years. Walter Tausig, my friend, is assistant conductor at the Metropolitan Opera. Leo Wormser, the late Leo Wormser, was assistant conductor at Covent Garden. Friedrich Wöhrer was head of the piano department at the Munich Conservatory. Walter Bricht at IU. Natasha Mark back there, whom we all know and love. Zubin Mehta, not entirely unknown. Bruno Seidlhofer, one of the leading piano teachers of Europe, who was my classmate. He had the good fortune not to have to leave under Hitler. Who then taught one of the names that many of you will know, Professor Hans Graf, who exchanged places with me and who is now teaching one of the former students of my wife in Vienna and is former student of Mrs. Cavallo-Gulli here. So you see, it all comes back. So be careful. So those are some of the, and I'm sure I'm leaving out some important names, some of the names who one way or another were influenced by Franz Schmidt. Franz Schmidt's works were widely performed in the German orbit. He wrote 2 operas, Notre Dame after Victor Hugo, and Fredegundis, a Germanic subject matter which suffered under a very poor libretto. Notre Dame was now again performed during the Vienna Festival of, I think, 2 years ago. I have here several recordings, which I will then put into the record library for anybody who is interested. I will leave them there for a week. They are not cataloged, but they will make them available to anybody who wants to listen. And before going on, I would like to play one little excerpt, the opening, the exposition of the Second Symphony of Schmidt. Of course, it's unfair to play excerpts, but it gives you a little bit of the style of the music. not the place to make a musicological or stylistic analysis of this music. I am deeply convinced that this music will have a revival. In fact, that's the wrong word. It has never died, but it has not found that wide a distribution that it deserves. But before we go into the reasons for that, I would like to give you a very short sketch of the career of Franz Schmidt. As I said, he was born in Pressburg. The family then moved to Vienna. He studied piano with Leschetizky. And Leschetizky's wife, Yesipova, who was perhaps the greater teacher of the two, thought very highly of him. Leschetizky somehow didn't take to him, and that feeling was very mutual. And Schmidt left Leschetizky. He did not even leave Leschetizky, he left the piano. Didn't touch it anymore. Studied at the gymnasium, as we all did, and studied cello. And began to compose. And the Helmesberger brothers, who were known, one as a violinist, one as a cellist, and had a great name in Vienna, were the most sarcastic people that you could ever find, a very nasty sarcasm, said at one time, nobody with the name of Schmidt should ever be a composer. And that is perhaps one of the reasons why Schmidt has not become known, because whenever I mention Schmidt, people think either of Hans Schmidt, who wrote Finger Exercises, or of Florent Schmidt, who is a distinguished post-impressionist French composer. But that's beside the point. Anyway, he studied cello, became cellist of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra and Opera Orchestra, and played hundreds of performances under Gustav Mahler. And he said at one time, conversationally, when I had played the solo in the Walküre, for the 100th time I gave up counting how often I played that piece. So he played under Mahler, then became professor of cello at the Conservatory of Vienna, became professor of composition, became director, became the second rector of the newly established Hochschule, had the Beethoven Prize of the Society of Friends of Music, Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna, and wrote 4 symphonies. One of them we will play an excerpt of, conducted by Mehta. Wrote later in his life a number of very significant organ compositions, and ended his compositional career with a big oratorio, the Book with 7 Seals. That's the Apocalypse set to music. I have heard the work done by Joseph Cripps in Cincinnati. It also has been recorded. I have the recording here. It's a huge work of music. So much for the career in very brief outline. The significant part of it is that he was not a pianist's pianist. He was not a cellist's cellist. He was not a composer's composer. He was all things, equally well. And this versatility has, I think, rubbed off on most of his students. One was a musician first, and then became whatever one was called for to do by circumstances or by one's inclination. The reasons why Schmidt's work has not been too well known outside of the German orbit, it was performed, as I said, in this country. There's an article here in the Diapason where he is called the Bach of the 20th century, no less. He was performed in London, but the reasons are manifold. They may be in the music, I don't know. I'm not enough of a musicologist, I'm not enough of a critic, I'm too close to this music to judge it perhaps objectively. But there are various other reasons. His flowering came after World War I, when the hostility against Germany and Austria was at its height. And it was different from the hostility that we all have against Nazi Germany. We still played Wagner in this country, even during the Second World War. This was not so during and after the First World War. All German music was taboo practically in France and England and so on. That was one of the reasons why his music did not pass the borders. He had to contend with Mahler's towering personality. There's no question that there was a bit of competition there. He was not a well man. He had a heart condition, which at that time was probably not diagnosed correctly. He had a heart condition for 25 years, had to take it easy, had to give up teaching, had to give up composing at times, so his oeuvre is not very large. He was a very shy man, basically. He lived outside of Vienna in Perchtoldsdorf, which was also the place where Hugo Wolf had lived, and so he was hard to get to, in a sense. He was Austrian, very Austrian, which means modest, not making much of himself. He had a very sad family life. His beloved daughter died very young, and the last excerpt that I want to play for you is meant to be a requiem for this daughter, and it is the second section of the Fourth Symphony. The Fourth Symphony is in one huge movement, two sides of one record, in the usual order of Allegro, Adagio, Scherzo, and last movement, recapitulation, if you will. And this second movement is a huge cello solo. There are many symphonies with violin solos, but very few with cello solos. But the cello remained Schmidt's favorite instrument. And apart from the teaching that I and we all received from him, which I would like to characterize a little bit, was the experience of being allowed to attend his weekly quartet evenings. He played quartet all his life, sometimes several times a week, with a violinist who was, quote, an amateur, very quote, very unquote. It was Dr. Oskar Adler, who was a philosopher, a medical doctor, a man active in adult education in Vienna, who left a manuscript, which is still unpublished, Critique of Pure Music. That alone gives you an idea of what the man stood for. As a violinist, perhaps the most genial violinist that I've ever met. An imagination and a freedom of playing within a chamber music ensemble that I have never heard since. Maybe Mr. Gingold, but few others. And these quartet evenings had a certain ritual. The other room was dark. Only a select few were admitted, and it always started with a Haydn quartet. But for a matter of 3 or 4 years, I was allowed to attend, and I got my early experience of listening to chamber music very, very early, much earlier than most other students have, and it's been an indelible impression. The quartet was of the highest order and could compete with any of the well-known chamber music organizations. You can easily believe that as a teacher, Schmidt was not a piano teacher in the sense in which we sometimes use the term. If you said, how do you do this trill? He said, well, all right, sit down and trill. See, in that sense, he was not a piano teacher. One came to him already technically more or less prepared. He did not impose any interpretation on the students, but he had such an aura, he had such a charisma, he had such a personality, and he suffered so cruelly under bad playing that one simply did not play bad. It was like cutting into somebody's flesh if one played wrong. And so we did really knock ourselves out, and the demands were high. On the negative side, he had such a phenomenal memory that I've seen that equaled only once since. Mr. Rostropovich came here for a master class, and somebody played the Lalo cello concerto. Now, the Lalo cello concerto is not a repertoire piece. And Rostropovich interrupted, said something in unintelligible English, better intelligible Russian, if one knew Russian, and had him start in the middle of nowhere and sat at the piano without a score and started accompanying from memory the Lalo concerto. And I have seen this only once before in my life, and that was Schmidt. He could sit down and play any Wagner opera, singing, whistling, playing, and it was sometimes better than what you heard in the opera. And he was very open to contemporary music. He was the first one to introduce Debussy in Vienna. He had a great affinity for Paris, which was not the customary thing in Vienna. He, on a winter night, with very few people in attendance, played his own transcription, piano transcription of Also Spake Zarathustra of Richard Strauss in the Bösendorfer Hall before it was performed by the orchestra. He was the first one to do the Pierrot Lunaire of Schoenberg in the school. It was one of the great griefs of my life that I wasn't the pianist. He chose somebody else. So he was very open to modern music. And of the symphony, that which you will hear a little excerpt, Alban Berg said, if one still is to compose in a tonal medium, this is what still makes sense. So he was by no means a reactionary. And this musical image that he has left with all of us, I think, has formed our lives. Let's play this little excerpt. This is, as I said, meant as a requiem for his daughter. So Emil Vetter and Franz Schmidt were the main influences on my life, I would say. And I may close by quoting very freely from what Goethe said. He uses the word demonic, and to describe a power of mind over mind which eludes natural analysis. It is a force that operates by suggestion, stimulus, and inspiration. These were the two people that had that demonic influence, and I'm grateful to them. And I want to add that I'm grateful to this country that has permitted me to exercise what little I have been able to gather from them and to pass some of it on to the students, and now to live a life of leisure and to switch from Bakrides to Bach, and from Homer to Haydn, and from Sophocles to Strauss, and to end the days that are given me at the side of my wife. And I thank you for listening. If you wish to look at any of the records, you may be interested in reading some of the outside descriptions, etc.